This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this webinar, Sports, Physical Activity and Dementia, Discussions for Practice. The content of this webinar is based on research and practice from the Association for Dementia Studies at the University of Worcester. We are so glad that you can join us. It's wonderful to have had more than 200 registrations from across the UK for this webinar, clearly demonstrating the level of interest in the topic, and I'm sure you're all looking forward to learning more. My name is Yvonne Thomas. I'm Principal Lecturer at the School of Allied Health and Community at the University of Worcester, and I'm the course leader for the MPhil PhD programme. I'm an occupational therapist by background, and I currently lead the McClellan Centre for Health and Wellbeing at the university. But my role this afternoon is to host and facilitate this webinar. Please can I ask that you ensure that your camera is turned off and your microphone is muted throughout this afternoon. That should cut down on any feedback or distracting noises throughout the session. Over the next hour, we will be hearing from Dr. Chris Russell, who will share findings of his recent research, which explored the experiences of people engaging in sports and physical activity within their local community leisure and fitness centre. From Becky Oakley, who will discuss findings from a study of women and their experiences of sports reminiscence. And finally, from Dr. Susie Scrivens and Tom Howard, who will share insights from a seniors physical activity and adapted sports programme, including reflections on their experiences of dementia cafes and meeting centres for people with dementia. There will be an opportunity for you to pose questions via the chat facility as the event progresses. I'll be reading the chat throughout the seminar, and I'll pose some of the questions to our speakers towards the end of this afternoon's event. Contact details for the speakers will be shown during the presentation, and a recording of this presentation will be sent out to you in the coming days. So if your question does not get answered today, our speakers would welcome contact from you following the event. This is an exciting opportunity to hear from colleagues who are building expertise in the engagement of people with dementia and their families in the context of sports and physical activity. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker. Dr. Chris Russell is a senior lecturer at the University of Worcester and leads the postgraduate certificate in dementia studies. His recent doctoral research explored the experiences of people engaging in sports and physical activity within their local community leisure and fitness centre. Chris, over to you.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, and good afternoon, everybody, wherever you may be. My name is Chris Russell. I'm a senior lecturer employed by the Association of Dementia Studies here at the University of Worcester. I'm also a registered social worker and a qualified sports coach. And as Yvonne says, this first presentation explores the experiences of people with dementia engaging in sport and physical activity within their local community leisure and fitness centre. So in terms of today's presentation, I'm going to talk you through a research project which extended over 4 years between 2016 and 2019, with the research phase extending over a 12-month period during that. The settings for the research were 3 community leisure and fitness centres, which I'll describe as centres. Broadly speaking, these are large institutions set within local neighbourhoods, offering a range of different physical activities and indeed sometimes social activities which are open to the public. 3 of these centres were run by charitable, 2 of these centres were run by charitable trusts, 1 by a private organisation. The focus for the research was around 4 people living with dementia and their experiences of engaging with physical activity within those centres over a 12-month period. However, other research participants included their family members whilst they were engaging alongside the person themselves within the activity at the centre, and the centre worker, the sports coach, fitness instructor, who was most closely allied to that person's experience. The rationale for the research is aligned to the 4th bullet point there, which is about identity and the influence of these activities and engagement upon identity, because research shows that strong identity supports adjustment to living well with dementia. So whilst that was the primary aim of the research, this inquiry was also very useful, I think, in understanding the experiences of people living with dementia as they engaged in sport and physical activity within their own community. And at the end of the session today, I'll be able to show you some learning and recommendations for practice. A very brief definition of dementia for those not familiar. It's when the brain is damaged by diseases such as Alzheimer's disease or a series of strokes. Now, Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia, but not the only one. And what you'll hear from today from all the speakers, I think, is that we're trying to get away from that kind of medical definition to look at dementia within the context, a person-centered context with a citizenship focus. So these presentations today are very much about the participants' place in the world and their ability to influence the world around them. I'd like to introduce you to the 4 primary research participants within the study, each given a pseudonym for ethical reasons. Clockwise from the top, Jackie, Paul, Leonard and Ivan, each person living with a different dementia-causing illness. Those were the primary research participants within the study, and we'll hear some more about their experiences as this presentation continues. However, as I said, there were others involved within the research, and this slide and this photograph gives you some idea of that context. So the research also captured insights of family members participating alongside the person. If that person was supported in such a way, one of my participants was not, and that in turn supplied very valuable learning in relation to that context. I would also like to draw your attention to the bottom 2 pictures on the right-hand side of this slide, because that gives you some idea about the context within which the research was carried out and how the centres were using the spaces that they had. So both the use of outside spaces proved beneficial, and also the flexible use of spaces was another positive feature that I found. You can see there music being used, so the arts-based activities were also included within the study and the study's findings, and I can say a bit more about that flexibility of space as we continue, but it's certainly a learning point from the study. The research methods and methodology was highly participative. So this is me engaging alongside the research participants during that 12-month period in various different activities with the aim of capturing individuals' insights in the moment as they participated within that activity, both through observation but also through discussion. There were multiple opportunities after the sessions ended for us to engage in reflection as well, where that was possible. But that just gives you a flavour, I think, of the kind of method that I was using as I was engaging alongside the research participants. Before I started the research, I scoped the scene and the context, and I was in contact with nearly 30 centres from across the country after having sent out a questionnaire. And I just highlight these 2 bullet points for you now early, because I do think they are important to reinforce the message as part of the learning from the study. Even at the start of the research, feedback was coming back that physical spaces being used flexibly was an important part of the offering that centres were already making. And also I noted from the questionnaires that came back that partnership working was a key element that centres were identifying as good practice in terms of their work alongside people living with dementia already. So partnerships involving health, care, the charity sector, and centres acting as part of a community hub. And again, when I round up at the end of the presentation, I'll return to that, because that is an important point of learning, I think. So turning now to the actual insights that the participants provided. In terms of the analysis, the analysis of my findings was that engagement enabled identity formation to continue. By engaging with the activities on offer, individuals were enabled for their identity to continue to form, and significantly that was often in forward-looking ways. So I've referred to it as aspirational, agentic. So that feeling that actually people, through what they did, still had a sense of themselves that was in some kind of control, that was forward-looking, so they could set goals and they could aspire to things that might be anticipated within the future. And that was important because it really did counter the traditional paradigm around dementia, which is about loss. So this was more about continuity, and that was positive. And in turn, that aided adjustment to life living with dementia. And my analysis enabled me to crystallize those core identity themes around individuals' sense of identity around sociability, resilience, freedom, and authenticity. Now, I'm going to give you some indication just by referencing two of the research participants, Leonard and Paul. That's Leonard there, who's playing a game of badminton, as you can see. I'm probably on the other side of that net, about to receive a shuttlecock very fast. It was great fun playing these games, and Leonard is a fine player. He was reporting his experience within the setting. It's a big help. It's all people in the same situation, getting on. Everybody speaks, everybody gets on well. He went on to say, I never used to talk to people straight away. People used to have to talk to me first, but I do that now. And then commenting on the overall feeling, he said to me, I like it. I feel like I've done something, being there and doing it. Brilliant, great, love it. So I think you can clearly see there the resonance around sociability and also agency in particular. Now, Paul was also a research participant, and although he was more poorly with Alzheimer's disease and probably the progression of his illness was more developed, his insights were valuable really for that very reason, because he was showing me, as you can see through this first short summary, that he was still engaging with play as he indeed always had done within his life. I noted that he and I played table tennis for 40 minutes. Paul smiled, chasing shots that were at the very extent of his reach. I reflected to him, you're a good player, Paul. And he said, you never lose it. So that sense of authenticity came burning through from Paul's account and was very valuable. Now, those were the individual insights, or some summary of the individual insights in terms of the research findings. What I'd like to do as I begin to conclude this presentation is to actually explore a little bit more around the wider data that I found, the cross-cutting themes from the analysis of my research, those that goes over and beyond those core identity themes for their implication for the identity of people living with dementia. And that is what this diagram shows, and I'm going to explain it to you. It's what was going on within the centres to enable the positive outcomes that I found, and things which indeed can lead to recommendations for positive progress. So this diagram summarizes that overview. And if I draw your attention first to the outer blue box, it's what I've referred to as the life world. So this is what was going on for research participants with dementia in their broader lives outside the physical confines and their experiences with the centre setting. And as I've alluded to earlier, I found that participants were able to take that positive influence from their identity, from engagement out into the wider world, particularly around sociability and also resilience. The inner box, however, looks at the place of the leisure centre, and it's the actual engine room of what was going on in terms of theory and practice. And if I can draw your attention to the middle green box there, which is badged opportunity structures. Now, some of you may be familiar with this. It comes from the literature around athletes with disabilities using sporting engagement as an opportunity for a personal reformulation of their future. Now, that had been applied in some contexts, but never alongside people living with dementia. And I used the opportunity structure model to help me understand how participants with dementia were reformulating their identity within those positive ways. And if I can just briefly summarize the three opportunity structures that I found: activity, adjustment, and diversity of activities. You can see them at the center of the screen. I will do so. There is some overlap because life is not a laboratory, and individuals are humans with different interactions, and undertakings. So activity, physical activity, can act as an opportunity structure, and those primarily are activities which enable a positive reformulation of identity for the person themselves. So that's important to note how participants felt about their engagement with the activity, or indeed whether they could be receptive to feedback from other people about that. Secondly, the opportunity structure at the bottom of that green box there around people, enabling people to adjust well to living with dementia. And for centres and similar settings, this is about tailoring their offering in ways to support people being active citizens, so sustaining participatory roles within their daily lives. So that could be something from enabling people to decide how they wish to play, right through to enabling people to take part as co-facilitators and indeed organisers of activities, which I did see on display. And finally, that diversity of activities was a key part in enabling opportunity structures, the reformulation of people's identity. So the choice that people had was very, very important in terms of what activities they participated within. That I found to be significant in terms of enabling people to reformulate their identity in positive ways. Now that is relatively complex within itself, but the key components that I've also drawn attention to within this theoretical model, you can see at the top the yellow box around the individual, and at the bottom around interactions. Now these were very important within the milieu that I'm describing. It is essential that when individuals participating in physical activity within centre settings are engaged, that there is some understanding of the attributes that they bring and indeed their life story. I found that to be highly significant. It doesn't have to be extensive, it doesn't have to be intrusive, but it has to be there. Underneath, you can see the box around interactions, and those were found to be absolutely crucial in order to make those opportunity structures work well. Family, workers, and the peer group that the person was engaged with were highly important within that setting. And if I could take the example of centre workers as just one example, I would say that it was important that individuals engaged in active listening and also facilitated a good and empathetic welcome on every occasion. So that is the broad description of the theoretical base, which I believe can translate into centre settings and other similar settings to enable those positive outcomes that my research found to be replicated. Now, in conclusion then, just some conclusions and recommendations. My research found that sport, physical activity and social engagement have much to offer in ways that I've just outlined, and I found that those things could coalesce within centre settings. I found, as I said, identity formation does aid adjustment and must be afforded status. So what I mean there is physical activity is known to provide physical benefits for individuals, including people living with dementia. However, that identity formation and the ability to form one's identity positively within those settings is also something which must be afforded status within policy and practice. Thirdly, and as I've alluded to in the previous slide, interactions and those human relationships matter. Without them, those opportunity structures cannot operate as well. Finally, I do believe centres are well placed to enable this. They are flexible spaces, they offer multiple opportunities, they are at the heart of their communities, and they are already engaged with local partnerships, as I have outlined. I would like to say, however, that other locations potentially could replicate these outcomes if they are so well plugged into those places, spaces, with those resources. So I would like to thank you very much for listening today. We're very keen to know how this research can help guide future progress. And if you would like to get in touch with us after that with that in mind, or to discuss any aspects of this presentation, we will be delighted to hear from you. Thank you very much indeed for listening to my presentation. I will now hand over to my colleague, Becky Oatley, to take you through the next stage of today's webinar. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I've had a few connection problems, so fingers crossed I stay online for the duration of this. Thanks Chris. As you said, my name is Becky. I'm going to share with you today some insert from my research into women affected by dementia and their experiences of sport reminiscence. Now, today is a bit of a brief whistle-stop tour, but I do believe that there are some really important lessons in my findings, not just for sports reminiscence practice, but for that wider context of sport, physical activity, and dementia care. So first up, what am I talking about? What is sport reminiscence? Well, reminiscence is a word that's kind of quite often bandied around in dementia care. It's suggested to be a really useful activity for people living with dementia. And it involves the sharing of past experience using prompts. So, for example, perhaps photographs or objects, in order to trigger memories and really encourage interaction. And it's thought to be particularly useful for people living with dementia because it makes use of memories from earlier in life that might be easier to recall in the most kind of typical pattern of short-term memory loss that we often see in dementia. And really, the key idea is that memories from the past can be kind of a conduit to feeling good in the present, whether that's because of what the memory is maybe about or because of the social interaction that it encourages. That said, it is important that I should say that reminiscence is an activity that almost all of us will do naturally at different times at any age in life. And it certainly shouldn't be restricted that this is an idea that this is something only done by older people. It's not something I'm going to go into today, but it's also just worth bearing in mind that reminiscence is not something that everyone necessarily enjoys. Some people don't want to look back, and some memories don't necessarily trigger positive emotions. But today the focus is sport reminiscence, and that is reminiscence that's specifically themed around sport-related triggers and events. So that might be something very specific, so perhaps a particular sport or a particular club, and it can be delivered in a wide variety of different ways. So, for example, inside a care home, in the community, might be one-to-one, in a group, could be a structured program of activities, or could be used as maybe a more informal kind of communication tool. Now, my study focused specifically on group activities that happen outside of care, so in the community. Why did I focus on women? Well, sport reminiscence was originally designed under the guise of encouraging men to take up group activities, on the basis that they were often quite reticent to join existing community groups. But this assumed kind of natural connection between men and sport is actually based on quite an oversimplistic rationale. This kind of link can make sport quite an exclusive environment, and can actually be maybe unhelpful to many people whose interests or identity vary from such a kind of basic stereotype. And this kind of quite limited view really encourages a kind of binary notion of what it means to be an older man or an older woman, that can be quite unhelpful to a lot of people. In fact, what I found out was on my kind of very early fieldwork visits, there were often many women at these community sport reminiscence groups, despite them having no voice or kind of presence in sport reminiscence research. And these were a real mixture of women living with dementia and also female carers. So really my research was about bringing some of those unheard voices to the fore, with a goal to kind of better understand both the concept but also the potential that sport reminiscence maybe has. And I did this by spending time visiting a number of different groups across England, taking part in activities, observing, and most importantly, talking to the different women that were involved. So what did I find out? Firstly, above all, social activity was the key draw that groups held, and I'm sure that won't be a surprise to many of you. Women who attended these groups as either women living with dementia or as carers all recognised that really the motivation was to meet new people, was to talk to people, over and above the context of sport or any relationship that they had with a particular club. And you can see this demonstrated here in the two quotes. So Margaret, who was a woman living with dementia, who admitted privately to me that she didn't really like sport. And she said, "I don't think I'd go if it was just to watch rugby. I've met lots of nice people, that's why I go." And also Helen, who's quite an interesting one because she was a lifelong season ticket holder and a kind of self-declared avid rugby fan. But when I asked her if the rugby club had relevance, she said, no, I think it's just people meeting people. And actually what might be really important here is that the sporting environment offers real promise as an appealing location that's perhaps a little bit removed from the stigma of health and social care or other older person services. The second thing I found was that actually sport reminiscence was often quite limited and could be quite an exclusive activity. In reality, often there wasn't that much evidence of reminiscence taking place. It was quite rare for people, and particularly women, to share their personal memories within the groups. Now, most of the reminiscence activities usually revolved around a kind of whole group discussion that could be quite difficult for people to take part in. Often you might have just 2 or 3 voices dominating the discussion, with other people either unwilling or sometimes even maybe unable to take part. And it was often actually quite rare for groups to make use of objects or to recognise different, perhaps non-verbal ways in which people could be engaged or take part. I should say that all the groups I went to were mixed. So that means they involved a combination of people living with dementia and without. And what this meant was that discussions actually often were held at a pace that meant people with symptoms that affected their cognitive speed or perhaps their ability to communicate might be overlooked. Sometimes they were unable to keep up. Sometimes they were even actually dismissed. And what I found was that some groups were actually very large and potentially very noisy. When I went had up to 80 people in attendance. And that actually made it a very unnatural environment for people to speak up or to interact with. And the challenges really of this kind of emphasis on verbal communication is summed up here by the reflections of Hayley, who brought her mother regularly to a rugby group. And she said, "It isn't so social here. Some people are quite verbal, so I guess for them it is more social. Some are obviously listening, but some only come for the free butties." This leads me on to my third point. Now, likely because group discussions were difficult and people often didn't share much in terms of reminiscence, group activities seem to have become a little diluted to maybe a more generic entertainment style group. So things like general knowledge quizzes that relied on good memory recall, sitting and watching videos or listening to speakers that didn't really involve much interaction at all. And what I found was that actually often it was the carers who were perhaps more engaged by activities, partly because activities simply weren't that adapted to take into account the different communication or support needs of people living with dementia. Now, many of these groups had very low staff numbers in place to kind of help with group staff or volunteers. And what that meant was that the people living with dementia were usually reliant upon their carer to support them to be involved. And I should say sometimes this happened, of course, but sometimes it didn't. And that seemed to be because the group actually also represented a real chance for the carer to access their own peer support, to talk to other people, to share their kind of challenges and their frustrations. And at times what happened was the social needs of the carer and the person living with dementia could maybe be a little bit in conflict. Now, without enough maybe staff or volunteers to support people with different needs, there was a real risk that these groups could serve only to maybe reinforce stigma and the exclusion that sometimes is experienced by people living with dementia. And Carol, one of the women that I interviewed who lives with dementia herself, reflected on this when she said, "Cafe is mixed group, and so family do most of the talking, and groups which talk over each other." And she screwed up her face and shook her head, really to indicate that this wasn't an environment that she felt included in. Indeed, one thing I would really urge is that although groups sometimes do have high numbers in attendance, I would urge caution before equating this necessarily with successful intervention. And finally, the topic of sport is loaded with cultural assumptions, but it can be a really meaningful topic for some women. Many of the women in my study did see that kind of group sport reminiscence environment as focused on the needs and interests of men and men's sport, sometimes even kind of dismissing their own connections to sport as either irrelevant, uninteresting, or unimportant. And what this reveals is just how strong that assumption is, that sport is this domain that somehow belongs to men. I think it's really important for us as practitioners, as researchers, as commissioners, to recognise that just because we say something is inclusive doesn't always mean that it is. And actually those wider kind of cultural, taken for granted assumptions might prove to be barriers that might prevent certain people from accessing things. That being said, many women in my study did reveal very significant and very meaningful connections to sport. Some represented kind of very typical gendered patterns of activity, so things like playing hockey, netball, washing their husband's kit, ferrying children around. But there were also many examples where women recalled activities that were maybe not so typical of gender. So, for example, I interviewed a champion motor racer, a woman who played football in her 20s, and many women who recalled early memories watching professional football or described themselves as avid fans. Now, the content of their sport-related memories showed that reminiscence could be a really useful communication. It offered an opportunity for these women to share aspects of their identity. So who I am, where I'm from, as well as things that I've done, maybe things that I know about, things I've achieved, but also maybe highlight similarities that we might share in common. And these kind of narratives can be really important and valuable for someone whose identity or sense of place in the world might be threatened by the stigma of dementia or even just old age. I'll finish with a quick example for you. So back to Carol. Now, Carol, for her, reminiscence about her sporting past brought a realization that her continued physical activity was a real kind of key aspect being able to uphold her sense of identity, of who she was. Now, her dementia significantly affected her verbal communication, so her talking, her speech. But for Carol, through long-distance walking challenges, she continued to be able to experience for herself and also to communicate to others a real kind of sense of toughness and competitiveness that she felt represented that same lifelong identity she had playing hockey as a young girl. So for Carol, that kind of process of sport reminiscence really helped her to recognise and also to uphold a sense of who she was in spite of the impact that dementia had elsewhere in her life. And she says it here, she says all these things, and she's pointing to a diagram: church, Carol service planning, writing, life admin. Not so good, but so walking is great, is better. I can do it. I can still achieve. The sport, hockey, walking the marathon, it's about who I am. So what are the key lessons then for practice? First up, sport reminiscence does have great potential as a tool to encourage communication, encourage interaction amongst a wide variety of different people, but only if we recognise the need to personalise that approach to take into account the very different interests and communication needs that people might have. Secondly, community group interventions really need to be carefully designed. They're not always effective, even if they do involve large numbers of people. Sometimes with large numbers, and particularly when they have low staff numbers, they tend to lose their kind of focus and the intent of activity. As a topic, sport can be a really meaningful way for some women, and I guess the important point is also some men, but not all men, to express aspects of their identity, to develop social relationships, to experience pleasure. And these are all really kind of important ways to living well-being in the present. Now, finally, I think that the context of sport actually holds great potential in moving us beyond this kind of classic conversational style cafe intervention to offer people opportunities to maybe do or even embody reminiscence. So I mean, not just talking, but also acting and interacting in a way that might still make use of past experiences in order to prompt feeling good and feeling included in the present. That's all I have for you today. There is lots more coming out of my study. I'd be really keen for people to get in touch with any questions or comments they have about my research. Hopefully there's been some interesting things in there today that have just made me think about what you're doing or what you could do. I'm now going to pass on to Dr. Susie Scriven and Tom Howard, leads of the University of Worcester Senior Physical Activity and Adapted Sport Programme. And they're going to share some of their experiences delivering physical activity pilots in different community dementia settings. So that's over to you, Susie and Tom.
Thank you, Becky. And good afternoon, everyone. My name's Tom, and along with my colleague Susie, we're going to give you a whistle-stop tour of our experience delivering some physical activity sessions in meeting centres across Worcestershire. So firstly, just to set the scene a little bit, we were invited to deliver these adapted physical activity sessions across Worcestershire in meeting centres and dementia cafes. Our main objective was really to provide a physical activity session by way of an introduction for Becky to open up the conversation with individuals in those groups about her PhD research. And given our experience developing the Senior Physical Activity and Adapted Sport Programme, of which we have around 300 to 350 older adults per week taking part in some form of sport or activity, we were really enthusiastic to support colleagues in the Association of Dementia Studies. And we both agree that even though we are both fairly experienced instructors, and we freely admit that initially we felt very much out of our comfort zone here, not having previously worked with clients in the dementia setting before. So, the experience itself. When we arrived at each cafe or meeting centre, it was typical for the day's programme to already be underway, and we were quite often the last people to arrive there. On entry, we'd try and find the centre staff and introduce ourselves, but it quickly became apparent that they had little time to chat and already had their hands full. And on quite a few occasions, staff were already delivering social activities themselves. So it was just a case of us giving a quick smile and they waved us in. We thought it was important to immediately immerse ourselves into each setting and start chatting to as many individuals as possible. At the same time as that, we observed everybody present to gauge the mood, their physicality, and their personal interactions within the setting. And we also observed the carers as well as the participants. And from that point of view, we kind of find ourselves undertaking a live risk assessment. Preparing for delivery, we typically found ourselves in community centres and village halls, and where one room would typically fit all the activities for the day. So that could be the social activities, the lunchtime activities, everything that was going on. And the room size seemed to vary quite significantly, as did the type of flooring and the furniture at the centres. So, for example, not all the chairs would have been our first choice, re their sturdiness. However, we were quite confident that the physical activity content was of a level that enabled us to adapt appropriately, no matter what the setting. We just made common sense choices as where to best position the circle of chairs and where to position ourselves. And we knew that we probably weren't going to have people moving around the outside of the circle. So part two of the experience, getting ready for delivery. And when it was time for the session to take place, we took the opportunity to observe each individual move across the room towards the chairs. And that might have been with the carer or just on their own. And this allowed us to gain some really valuable information about each participant's mobility, their mood, and their coordination. And on occasions, a couple of people had no wish to engage whatsoever, but that was perfectly okay. In our first session, we were both taken a little aback by some of the people who had symptoms of dementia that meant their behaviour could be disinhibited. And this sometimes meant there was some shouting, there was some swearing, the odd inappropriate or crude comment. And at that point, it was quite common for the carers to step in and feel the need to apologise. But we thought it was just more important to roll with it, make light of it, and use our energy to keep the session moving. When there was enough support available in the group settings, we tried to encourage those who could stand and work by the chair to do so. Just because there was enough people, and we thought they'd probably get a little bit more benefit being stood up. Music and equipment, typically we use music throughout the sessions, and this did add value in the fact that it could increase the mood of the room, make people a little bit more happy. But it was also good for stimulating people who weren't so engaged in the movement or found it harder to follow the verbal instructions. In terms of equipment, we took a range of equipment with us, so different bands, balls and bean bags, and they offered different versatility in size, shape, texture and weight. But we didn't have any preconceived ideas of how we'd probably use the equipment in one session. We just knew that a range would be useful and that we'd be ready to adapt in the moment. And then as the sessions progressed, we typically found that they averaged around 45 minutes long. After a session, we found the need, 10 minutes or so after each session was often needed for a bit of verbal feedback and interaction with the carers and leaders. And I'm just going to pass you over to my colleague Susie, who will take you through the next part of our experience.
Okay, thank you, Tom. In the second part, I'll chat briefly about our preconceived expectations as fitness instructors versus our experience during delivery of the sessions. At the University of Worcester SPARS programme, we educate our clients to take personal responsibility for their health and well-being. We challenge stereotypes and we don't worry about chronological age. We constantly adapt our content to ensure that no one ever has to leave our programme. Next slide, please. As instructors, we typically arrive first at our venue. Here, we were arriving last with little awareness of place, space, and the people therein. This made us reflect upon how controlled and linear our fitness instructor process typically is. We arrive, we meet, we greet, we begin a class, we deliver a start, a middle, and end, we have chat, we have feedback, repeat. But equally, we welcome clients who've chosen to attend our sessions. And on the whole, what we found at the centres were that clients didn't really know why we were there. Typically, we'd expect to greet a client and they'll tell us all about their activity profile, their health, their well-being, and everything about their life. However, the delivery in the meeting centre settings is clearly different. We need to address issues around interactive verbal communication, and this presents a new challenge, I believe, to the sport and exercise industry. Again, typically after screening a client, we would receive ongoing verbal updates about their health and conditions. And in this setting, building rapport will be different. You have to be ready for the client who just ups and leaves, but it's up to you to adapt. You have to adapt your mindset and simply embrace the mood and just continue through the session and progress onwards. We'd naturally expect clients to follow our lead and understand that the content that we're delivering is absolutely great and it's good for them. In these settings, you have to recognise and accept that group members will participate in their own particular way. I think our kind of message to ourselves was just keep going. As instructors, don't panic and carry on. And any lack of reaction from the group is actually not a reflection on the quality of your instruction. I think it's very important that as instructors, when you're working in these environments, that you don't look for your stylized, well-synchronized group response during class and group-based activity. Again, typically an instructor prepares session plans. You have steady progression, you move on week relative to the ability of your groups. In these sessions, you have to be prepared to deliver each week as if it were your first. And importantly, we also found, though, that as an instructor, whilst this is quite a challenge, you will certainly experience growth in your self-awareness and development of people skills. I'd just like to hand back to Tom.
Thanks, Susie. So some initial reflections on our experience. Firstly, the whole experience was very fluid. We both agreed that was probably one of the most reactionary and adapt in the moment sessions either of us have experienced. And it demonstrated to us that instructors have to appreciate progression in the classic sense isn't relevant here. This is a freestyle instruction in its truest sense. Equally, when a sequence worked, we promptly adjusted the routine and tried to stay with it. Music didn't play a traditional role in framing the routine, for example, beats per minute and rep count, but rather it bridged the verbal communication gap and offered the chance for participants to sing along, smile and clap their hands. We fully appreciate working with older adults doesn't often represent the glamour end of the sport and exercise industry. However, personal satisfaction is something that most instructors seek. For example, the clap at the end of the class, happy smiling faces, thank yous, smiles, etc. At the end of our sessions, 1 or 2 carers stayed and chatted, but in the main, everyone just headed over for lunch, and that was the end of it. Ordinarily, we expect feedback on tangible benefits evidenced over time. This can't be the expectation here. Rather, we think you're aiming to influence mood and mobility in the moment. Positive feedback often comes secondary at best, often from carers or workers. And finally, it was really valuable to see that we gave a small period of respite to those carers who stayed and joined in through the physical activity and the release of endorphins, etc. But we observed most carers didn't tend to stay at the meeting centre, as this was often their 5-hour or so respite period. And I'll just hand you to Susie for future thoughts.
Okay, thanks, Tom. So looking ahead, we think that the difficulties of client screening will pose issues for the fitness insurance industry in working in this environment. It may be in the future that the quality and the ability of an instructor per se becomes of greater relevance than completion of the standard PAR-Q form. Also, novice instructors shouldn't be left to work alone in these sessions and just, if you like, thrown in to deliver. It's very important that any instructor receives ongoing mentoring from senior colleagues for quite a considerable time. As Tom and I have mentioned, we were very experienced instructors and we found the environment quite daunting until we sort of familiarised ourselves and got into our stride. We think that there is clearly a need for us to develop networks of best practice through the sector, through the industry, and sharing our knowledge with clinicians. Equally, we found that care professionals that we met at all of the centres we visited demonstrated great empathy and understanding of their clients. There is clearly a market here for the sport and exercise industry to develop training for care professionals as exercise activators. Our sessions were, if you like, uplifting in the moment. We were in the here and now. We believe that it would be very useful to welcome academic research to investigate if delivery over time could have a measurable effect on mood and mobility. And then finally, at UW, when we started the SPARS programme, we began with exercise classes and then channeled our developing expertise into the adaptation of sports to make them inclusive for adults, older adults to play. Undertaking this work with Becky has granted us a platform from which to undertake a new yet similar journey of discovery in initially adapting exercise classes and then following on with adapting sports as suitable for people living with dementia. Our industry, the sport and exercise industry, should definitely not be afraid of developing both inclusive sessions and exclusive delivery. We'd like to thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much for those 3 absolutely wonderful presentations. Very different angles on the same subject. And whilst you've been talking, presenters, there's been some questions that have been posed. So I'm going to start to ask some questions now. I'm going to start with Chris. Everywhere. So let me start with this. Chris, Margaret Hook has asked, what if she can't get her husband to go to leisure facilities if he doesn't feel safe to leave the house? I wonder if you could perhaps respond to that.
Yeah, thanks very much, Yvonne, and thanks very much everybody for your questions. Margaret, it's very difficult for me to give absolute advice without having met your husband, but certainly in terms of my research, what I found was peer support was very useful. So if people could go along with people who'd been along before, possibly other people who were living with dementia, carers who were living with dementia, with somebody with dementia, that was found to be helpful. That kind of peer support, that peer networking, possibly building up gradually, so meeting somebody not in the context of the sport and the physical activity setting if that's what's worrying somebody beforehand, but actually sort of building up to it. Certainly in terms of the research, what I found was that once somebody was over the threshold, so to speak, if the facilitation was good and they were genuinely welcomed and they were enabled to engage as they wished to engage, then future participation and engagement was was great, was much better. Now, those are just my reflections based on my experiences and based on some of the research findings that I had. And of course, it would never be right to force somebody to do something they didn't want to. But I am very much in tune with the issue that you put forward, and I know it's a difficult one, but those would be my reflections.
Thank you very much, Chris. We have one more question as well. Actually, there were two that I think you could probably deal with at the same time. So Jonathan Fowler posed a question about, he thinks that you went to overseas to collect some data, and did you find any comparative differences overseas? And then Kay Davenport asks, how did you go about selecting your participants? Were they from different socio-economic groups? So we're talking about diversity here. Would you like to talk to that?
Yeah, thank you very much. So, Jonathan, in answer to your question, I didn't conduct any research abroad, but you're quite right. I did go to continental Europe and engage and observe with different contexts in that part of Europe. And what I'd say in very brief summary is that, yes, of course, there will always be some cultural context to your engagement, because sport is deeply rooted within different cultures. But actually, at its best, sport and physical activity can be a wonderful enabler, which actually cuts through those things if they're ever going to be barriers. So actually, I found that it's a wonderful way for people to sort of engage as equals potentially, without necessarily too many preconceptions. So thank you for that question. And in terms of your question, Kay, I had 4 research participants, so I was never aiming for my study to be just generalizable in the sense of that it was a big study. The value of my study was the fact that it was deep and rich engagement with 4 people, getting to know them very, very well, so their experience can be captured and understood. And the reason I'm saying that is because up until the point of this study, I don't think, and I did a comprehensive literature review for my study, I don't think there's been any similar study done. So I set my recruitment criteria for my participants quite widely to enable me maximum choice, really, to recruit people who really could contribute as fully as possible, because I wanted to understand as deeply as possible. So I gathered my research participants through that scoping exercise that I undertook, so the questionnaire, and also via one person who a colleague of mine knew was engaging. That's how I did it. Thank you for your question. I hope that was helpful.
Thank you very much, Chris. Now I'm going to go to Becky. Becky, there was a question there about whether the project was associated with the Sporting Memories project. Becky, could you answer that one?
Yeah, of course. So for people who don't know, the Sporting Memories Foundation is a large charity that has really been responsible, I guess, for showcasing sport reminiscence in the UK and really developing it. Now, my project wasn't specifically with the Sporting Memories Foundation, but they are responsible for sport reminiscence. So they offer some training and resources to organisations, but there are also lots of smaller community groups doing sport reminiscence, and increasingly lots of professional sports clubs, so professional football clubs, rugby clubs, cricket clubs, developing their own groups, so the sort of community foundation wings and things like that. So the answer is no, not specifically, but they are a huge provider of sport reminiscence activity.
Thank you. There was another question which has been actually raised and then answered on the chat group. I'm sure you might have seen some of those, about resources for sports reminiscence. Did you want to add anything to that at all?
I mean, just to say that I think one of the most important things that comes up time and time again in research is that the best outcomes for reminiscence always come when the resources are really tailored to the individual. So it's not just kind of a generic sporting, let's remember the World Cup, but something that's really specific to that person's history and interests. So thinking about care homes is finding maybe photographs from that person's particular era, particular club. I mean, somebody like the Sporting Memories Foundation has got a huge resource online. So has the BBC, got lots of archival stuff. But I think what's really valuable is when we then take these resources and don't just look at them online, but have them for people to hold, to touch, to draw on, things like that, making it a much more kind of engaging experience than just maybe looking at things on a screen. So key is personalisation and thinking about what you can then do with those resources.
Thank you. Thanks ever so much, Becky. There was one other question which I think raises a really interesting idea, and you might have some opinion about that, and that is that where we've got people who have a history of being the sports coach or a sports athlete, and whether they could potentially get involved in coaching.
Yeah, I think certainly that's something that if that's a key part of somebody's identity, ways in which we can enable them to uphold that can be really valuable. I think that kind of also brings in this question in sport reminiscence, that it's not just about different sports. Actually, sport is such a huge concept where people have so many different roles, activities, that actually trying to bring together all these different cultures just in the one group can be quite a challenge, and sometimes we need to think of more individual ways in which we can support people with their particular background. But yeah, certainly I think that's a great idea.
Thank you. Thank you again. Thank you to those people who are posting questions now. I'm going to just talk to what some of the questions that came up earlier, but the questions that are coming up now we will respond to later, and if not in the event, after the event. So thank you. I think I'm going to move over to Susie and Tom, actually. So Susie and Tom, and either of you can answer, you can work it out between yourselves. I wonder if you could give us some insight into how you think COVID-19 might affect sports and physical activity provision for people with dementia.
Okay. I think COVID-19, if handled correctly, is going to be a cloud with a silver lining. What we're finding across a lot of our able-bodied sports at the moment is that there is a lot of funding. And if I said flooding the sector, it's obviously got to be applied for and secured, and there's got to be proper plans in place. But I think if people are very sensible and work in collaboration, if you like, as leisure centres, as community centres, as clinicians, and as sport and exercise instructors and coaches, and work, the channel I would go through is through your local sports partnership or activity partnership. I think some very smart funding packages could be put together that could be aimed and target sessions and content for people living with dementia.
Thank you, Susie. And there is another question that's, I guess, come to mind about insurances and what are the issues around insurance for people who are running leisure centres if they're trying to engage people with dementia who may not be able to give an accurate history of their medical conditions and the park queue, etc.
Okay, Tom, shall I pick this one up? He keeps his microphone off. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, okay. We obviously operate from a university setting and have all manner of insurances for all manner of things. So we were really fortunate in that we've been able to go back into our university insurance company and have discussions about how we may broach this issue. Now, obviously, if you've got a carer who's bringing somebody living with dementia along to sessions, perhaps they can complete a PARQ and give some screening background. However, I think Chris noted that he had participants who actually were just there on their own and they were independent and didn't have that support. And I think that I mentioned in our presentation that the insurance industry is going to need to get its head around this idea that actually somebody living with dementia may not be able to communicate their health feelings and their emotions and how they are feeling on any particular day. And so Tom and I we discussed this and we were very clear about our risk assessments. We call them very much live risk assessments. We were aiming our activity at RPEs of around 3 and 4, and hence we talked about mood and mobility rather than physical activity and physical gains in fitness. So that was very safe. Also, I talked about very experienced instructors. It's not an environment for the initial novice instructor to go into. And I think this is where the insurance companies will need to recognise, if you like, me as an instructor with my career-long experience, my qualifications, my training, and therefore my personal ability. But in the university setting, it's as with all things, the insurance company have actually taken a very balanced approach to this. And their sort of response is, well, as long as you have your qualifications and you've done your risk assessments and you're going into an environment and you've taken account for the fact that you may be needing to do a live risk assessment in the moment, you know, you're covered. We are insured. And I think every leisure centre, every group, every community centre needs to have those similar discussions with their insurance company.
Sorry, Susie, I'm going to have to break in there because we've got to 3 o'clock and it's time to finish the session, but everything will be recorded, as I've said before. So for everybody who is still with us, thank you very much for staying with us for the webinar. Thank you to our four speakers today, and it's been a really, really interesting webinar. The recording will be sent out to people. And other questions will be answered, or you can contact our presenters after the event. So thank you very much. Do be proactive, and if you want to keep in touch and be involved in our future work, please let us know. Thank you very much.